Okay, you ready and stuff? Three, two, one. Hello and welcome to the Roundtable Podcast. I am Shogun. Thank you to Ainsof, our recorder today, to our live audience, and especially to our special guest, SoulDiver, an old friend of mine. I know him to be a autodidact, as he describes, fairly deeply learned, especially in theology. A religious man, a man of faith, a man who's had some unusual experiences, and I know from personal experience, a relatively forgiving man, which is an admirable quality. So thank you for making some time to be with us today. SoulDiver, how are you, sir?
I'm good. It's 6:05 here, so I'm full, ready to converse.
Perfect. Basically, you and I have a shared interest in theology. We are both men who have studied the Bible. We both consider ourselves Christians of different sorts. So we can certainly get into that aspect of things. But anything is on the table for this conversation. It's sort of a casual interview podcast, and I do think maybe we should get that story out of you if we can, that we've always wanted to get but haven't quite got out, if you'd be willing to share that. So first, I guess, were you born into your faith, or how did you come to be a Christian in the first place?
In a general sense, you could say, yeah, I was born into the faith. Um, but of course, growing up in a specific denominational family, right? In this case, it was Pentecostal. I never followed any of the specifics of it as just a kid, obviously. To me, it was just sort of a cultural thing that was just, you know, part of my upbringing. So it's not that I didn't give it any serious thought in terms of God, but being young and being preoccupied with the things that children do, I wasn't prepared really to give a, you know, give my Christian identity a really deep theological analysis. So starting out in the faith in a general sense, yeah, but it wasn't until I reached actually closer to my late 20s and early 30s before I really grounded myself. That's not to say that I had never had a relationship with Christ, but I definitely recognized and understood in fullness what being a Christian was versus being under what I might refer to as the spell of Christianity. Um, and when I say that, I mean the distinction between more or less just a tradition, theological tradition, versus the actual undertaking of going into a relationship with God, a Christian as a servant to God. So that was a little different for me. So I guess you could say I came to know what it is to truly be a Christian as a man. Um, but it was convenient to have that upbringing on both sides of my family, mother and father. I actually maintained uh, pastors, and one of which had a master's in theology. So I definitely had access to the information at a young age, but definitely it came into play later on in life.
Okay. And what would you describe, like, how could you describe your faith? Because you don't even necessarily call yourself a Christian, and like, do you belong to a particular sect, denomination? Can you define or classify your Christianity at all?
I don't mind the word Christian. I just try to generalize and describe myself as a servant to Jesus Christ. Um, you know, but I personally don't mind the word Christian as long as people understand the distinction. Because typically the question I get is, "What denomination are you?" It's as if that's truly the standard of what Christian identity is defined by. But in truth, Christian identity is defined by your personal relationship with Christ, right? And recognizing what the revelation of Jesus Christ is, which is God revealing who He is, His person, His identity, His purpose, and then knowing that you can enter into the body of believers who recognize the truth. So for me, a denomination is just, you know, from a technical point of view, it's just a theological subset. I think I kind of lucked out not really identifying with any particular denomination as a child. It was to my advantage in giving me sort of a clean slate to develop a true identity as a Christian. So it's not that I have a problem with the word Christian or that label in itself. I actually refer to myself as a Christian often. I guess I just choose my audience wisely, um, given a lot of the lack of distinction between Christianity and Christian identity.
So you have had some experiences in your life that go beyond the faith of the average Christian and are sort of supernatural or paranormal or divine in some respects, correct?
Yes, sir.
So can you describe the first one of these that you remember, the first time you experienced something that was supernatural that you remember, just in whatever way you can?
Sure. My first encounters with things like this were not direct in the sense that they happened to me specifically. At first, it was just things that I either heard or had known from family members. So, miraculous, unexplained healing, or um, seeing people, who didn't even have a high school degree, dropouts, who were speaking languages that I myself knew these people for years, and there's no way that they didn't learn, a dead language over the weekend. So things like that. I mean, I had a great grandmother who, um, people might speculate and consider if she was just hallucinating or whatnot, but um, she had encounters um, with what she described as angels, and had inoperable brain tumor that she was basically given like a 70% chance of surviving, healed overnight, and the doctor having absolutely no explanation. Like, I mean, it was a tumor, so it's not, you consider that that is pretty miraculous that a mass um, that was, claiming her life just shrunk and disappeared into thin air overnight, and it just happened to be in concert with her having a encounter with what you described as an angel, and because those things can be debated. It's not that I, you know, don't believe that they happen, but I know that someone who's more skeptical could say, well, it's probably some malfunction in her brain, and because of that sort of seemingly rational skepticism, um, that's sort of why, as a youth, it's not that I had doubts, but I really didn't have any direct experience to be able to have much of a stance on it, more than just the fact that I acknowledge that, the metaphysical or the supernatural, um, things of divine nature do exist. I, I was just inexperienced, but my personal experience, this actually happened in my later years in life, um, and I can go into an explanation of that one if you like. So my first encounter actually, uh, more or less began at, I guess, the point in my life where my faith had been fully convicted. So I can give a little backstory on that. I I was, as you described when you opened the show, I do fancy myself sort of an autodidact, and in as much I had been at what at the time was the pinnacle of my research, and I essentially reached a dead end. I was researching everything, all of the famous questions that mankind has ever asked about origins and future and what is real and what is unreal, things of that caliber. And of course, having that background, that Christian identity, that naturally came into play when I got to that tier of question. And I, I had accepted that um, the things that I had researched and encountered were just unexplainable. Even with, and I'm not boasting, but even with my um, mechanical aptitude, I just didn't see any explanation with the information that I had available. So I leaned on the possibility of revelation, um, the actual act of having something revealed, not the book of Revelation, and had called upon God by name. At the time, I'd used um, the Hebrew name, but it's no different than what it's transliterated into, which is Jesus. And um, I had been at this for a while, probably maybe a month or two straight, in intense prayer, and every chance that I was alone, maybe 2 hours a piece, something like that. I would just lose track of time, being like so deep into it because I was really desperate for answers. Like I said, I had reached what I had known at the time as the pinnacle of my research. So I was up against the wall, and I was beginning to question a lot of things, actually, even my own faith. And I, in a general sense, just asked for God to, you know, just. I know it's funny because a lot of atheists always ask this question, why doesn't God reveal Himself? But that's precisely what I did. I asked I asked that um, of God, but didn't assume that it would be granted. And I mean, the way that it worked out is a few years before I met my wife in 2011, I had my brother-in-law at the time with me, and a girl that I had been dating. We had been watching a movie. I At some point we had all passed out in the living room. Um, we hadn't been under the influence of anything. It was just a genuine, honest get together between three friends. And at some point in the middle of night, somewhere around, say, 11:10 p.m., I wake up and I have no idea why, but I wake up the same way that you would if you had a nightmare, except there was no reason. I just woke up and it was instinctual, as if I was in a defensive mode. So there was something that was going on around me, but looking around me, all I saw was a man and a woman that were asleep in my apartment. So I didn't think anything of it. And I give me one second. So I shot up, like I said, looked around, didn't see anything out of the ordinary, shook it off, grabbed myself some water, and at this point, I happened to actually notice um, some light in the distance. Um, Now, I didn't think anything of it at the time because where I was staying, I lived in a gated community, and it was very common for people to come through the back gate. So lights, people would come around the bend, and their lights would shine in the direction of my window. So I'd assume that's what it was, and only having been awake for 2 minutes, I was naturally skeptical as to what I would even be looking at. I didn't really trust my senses, knowing that it's not that I was necessarily groggy, but just giving skepticism the benefit of doubt. And long story short, I ended up realizing that I was not looking at a light of a car or of a bike or of a runner with a headlamp. It was some sort of, at the time I didn't know what to describe uh, what I was seeing. Just seemed to be some sort of uh, an elongated teardrop shaped uh, light. just this luminous figure that was like sort of hovering above the ground, but it was at the height of a man. So, I really didn't know how to explain that. And it was the most amazing thing that I'd ever, that had ever happened in my life. I'd never seen anything. I'd never had an experience like this. So naturally, I was glued to what I was staring at. And when reality settled in, and I realized that I was dealing with uncharted territory, instincts kicked in, and there was like a sense of vulnerability. And the moment that I felt that, it's as if this light uh, was aware of my feelings, and you know, it was kind of a sense of panic for a second when I realized, hey, I'm looking at something that's unexplainable. Okay, so now what happens? So, like I said, reality kicked in, and there was a little bit of fear involved, and then this thing begins recognizing my presence, and there's this moment where it's crossing the sidewalk across the inner street within the gated community, and then crosses over to my sidewalk, comes down a corridor, and it's at this point that I realized that the shape of that I was incorrect about the shape. The shape was more like a elongated kite, a diamond-shaped kite with an elongated bottom and a short top. And there did seem to be what appeared to be like a cross down, and across the middle. So lining right up with the points on the kite. Now, that's what I thought it was, but um, when it became closer, I could essentially tell that I was staring at um, sort of I guess to crudely describe it, like a reverse silhouette, where instead of a shadow, it was a figure of a man stretching out his arms, and the light was just the glow around the figure, which, like I said, from afar looked like a cross. Um, it's at this point that I realized that I'm basically having like a Damascus Road encounter with what most Christians would refer to as the Holy Spirit, um, which I can go into detail about what my views are on that afterward. But I was having a divine encounter basically, and it was crazy looking at the light, right? Because it's sort of the thing you would expect encountering the Spirit of God. You have sort of this almost infinite light, brighter than anything you've ever seen, um, and absolutely no shadows were cast. So if you had a lamp, there would be points where the light would not touch, or maybe the shadows would have around us. Um, but God's light had absolutely no shadows. It's almost as if all of the shadows escaped his divine presence. And you know, no matter how articulate I am, I have no basis of comparison of describing what I saw. But I can tell you, you know, what I also felt too. Um, when you're standing before the presence of God, other than the fact that you're staring at God, you know that that's who you're speaking with. I can go an explanation why that is in a technical sense, but to go back to the moment at hand, I felt basically all of these this feeling of perfect authority, right? Perfect control. So it's as if it was I was having all these feelings I was going through at once. I was frightened because I could tell that the presence was like just absolutely strong. I mean, I could tell that by comparison, I'm nothing. I could be easily smashed. Um, in an instant, I could be destroyed. And you get that just from standing in the presence. You also, at the same time, as strange as it sounds, get a perfect sense of serenity. So everything is in perfect working order. Like God exudes the ultimate strength, the ultimate state of calmness, like a serene nature. Um, there's an intellect. There's all of these things, and you automatically pick up on that. And then, of course, came the part where the communication began, right? And this is kind of weird because when this was happening, it wasn't as if uh, it was audible in the sense of how I'm talking to you and you're listening to the actual sounds coming out of my vocal, out of my voice, right? Um, but when I was speaking with God, it was more like a almost like a emotional or for lack of better words, empathic form of communication. So it was it was if you know just me having these feelings was automatically understood in a language and then communicated back with feelings, except you actually it's audible in the sense where you have there's a monologue going on or a dialogue between you and God going on with your minds. It's not like it's some sort of schizophrenic thing. I mean, it's like a form of language that's uh, like a hybrid between emotional and our common audible language. So it's really strange. And when I had thought about this afterwards, I immediately remembered encounters in the Bible where when others had mentioned at sometimes witnessing uh, God's voice, right? Or they would hear a language that they didn't understand, or they would hear like some sort of murmuring or something, but they couldn't exactly make it out. So I naturally thought of Paul's encounter, his Damascus Road encounter, and essentially I was in the same place where, I mean, I happen to be a believer, right? But I was at a place where I was dwindling in my faith. I definitely wasn't any kind of person deserving of having an encounter with God, that's for sure. It's not to say that I was some kind of like straight up degenerate or anything, but believe me, there are plenty of people in the world who deserved it way more than I did. So that's kind of a shocker. Um, but I guess it's God's choice. It's not up to me. Um, Now, when this communication was going on, as corny as it sounds, right? Um, the way when you're spoke to, it does come off in that sort of old-fashioned tone, right? Sort of that like Shakespearean sort of dialect, not exactly, but just in an old-fashioned sense. So there was this, um, you know, sorry, I cut out for a second. So there was this general old-fashioned sense, in the way that God spoke, and it was exactly like something that you would read out of the Bible, where he tells me, "Fear not," and then basically comes to explain to me that, of course, I'm not any harm, but like he's recognizing that I'm recognizing what is going on, and the encounter was pretty short, to be honest. I can't explain why, but I was only able to stay conscious for a few moments. I mean, like I said, this took place at 10, or I mean, sorry, like at 11:10 maybe. And within just a few, 2 or 3 minutes, and then the point where God was actually standing, His Holy Spirit was actually standing at my doorstep, as funny as it is, and I'm looking at Him through the kitchen window that faces my doorstep. Um, and that interaction was very short. And funny thing is that there was a point, right? Uh, Come to think of it, that he was outside the door, and then at a point, it almost seemed as that there was like no barrier in my own house and the apartment between myself and God, which is strange. But essentially, right after he basically, he revealed himself to me, and we had that short interaction, which basically was per my request by prayer. um, I began to notice that um, I started having more of like my human side kick in, if you will, like my the ignorance of the flesh, I guess, if you want to put it that way. And I began to uh, feel, sort of out of my element. Um, and I looked down at my hand, noticed that the glass that I was holding this entire time, just one second.
Sins of the flesh.
So I noticed that the glass I was holding began to slip um, through my grip. I maybe at the time I assumed it was just condensation, but as I tried to move the rest of my body, I noticed that I was froze, and it was I wasn't sure at first why, and then I realized that I was basically starting to sort of like fall back as if I was going out. I know you have a martial arts background, so I'm sure you're familiar with, or maybe or maybe you're not. Uh, but what it feels like to be choked out or to lose consciousness, where essentially everything goes dim, and so you get tunnel vision, and then right as soon as you have that like 2 to 3 second window where if you're gonna go, you're gonna go, and then when you do, you're just out. Um, and I woke up maybe about 30 to 40 minutes later. So I did have what people describe as like a missing time. And when I woke up, the first thing I did, being in the kitchen and waking up on the floor, was look at the clock, and I noticed that at least 30 minutes, in the very least, had passed. And um, of course, I wanted to get up and tell everyone. But the first thing I immediately thought is, you know, the girl I'm dating was dating at the time will think that I'm crazy, and my brother-in-law will, have juicy family gossip, and I'll be labeled as a kook. So I didn't tell anybody for a while, and basically did the stupid thing and started to doubt myself and my experience, going through what I thought was, a rational line of thought, thinking to myself it could be a hypnagogic state, or it could have been this, could have been that. And when I initially made that prayer, I thought that I would receive the answers that I was looking for if I could only see God, and then my faith would be confirmed, and never again would I doubt anything. And like I was totally wrong, because all that did is actually minister more questions than answers. And it's not that I was in a worse state, because since that day, which was 2011, no joke, I think about it at least twice a day. So there's not been one day since then where I have not thought about it. Um, and it's hard to you can't separate an experience like that from yourself, especially if you grew up as a Christian. But then that for me just confirmed my faith. But you know, like I said, I still started to doubt started to doubt whether or not I could even trust my senses. I of course did that foolish thing, and so again, um, I went back to prayer and made a second request. And the second request that I made was essentially to um, be given confirmation that my eyes were not deceiving me, that I was not met by some wandering spirit or something like that. I didn't want to be deceived in any way, whether by my own ignorance of the flesh, or whether it was because I was duped by some satanic agency or something like that. I didn't want to be a fool, basically. And I can go into the second experience if you want. Um, it's up to you.
Well, it's up to you, really. I mean, you've had an interesting life. You have a unique perspective. So, I mean, I have lots of questions I could ask you, but also, what would you most like to cover? Is there a message you have for people? Like, so here's the thing. I've known you for a while. I know you're deep into theology. You've had a lot of these kind of spiritual experiences. So, what do you see as your kind of mission now? Like, what's the goal? Who's the enemy? What's the purpose? Like, where do you put the pieces on the chessboard in terms of your life now?
I'm 100% confirmed in my faith as a Christian per the identity, which means I'm 100% anti Satanist, anti Freemason, anti, I'm essentially a willing slave to the biblical thesis and completely opposed to the satanic antithesis. So naturally, I'm going to, you know, of course, any Christian would want to cover the basis of that identity and spread the word, minister to people in whatever way you're deemed, and um, of course, I cover all of those things. But personally, I guess if you want to put it that way, my mission, um, like these are still things that I myself am figuring out. In my second encounter, that sort of came. I guess it was there was something revealed to me essentially in my second encounter that I'm sort of still waiting to see how this unfolds. Like I'm, I'm not, I don't profess to be some kind of a psychic or anything, um, but there are certain things that I know that I'm starting to lean towards the idea that maybe that is part of, I guess, a message that God could possibly have for me to give to others, which is also why I pray on it and am hesitant. And you know, I have faith, God willing, that when the message that God desires me to deliver needs to be delivered, that it will be known to me. I mean, at this point, I can speculate, but things are beginning to be revealed to me even now. Um, Things regarding revelations, things regarding the current state of affairs in the world and where we are, I guess if you want to word it this way, in a dispensational sense. Um, and if you like, I can explain what I mean in regards to my second experience, because that is sort of um, what makes this, I, I guess, feel as though that um, I'm on God's time in a sense. Um, During my second encounter, like I said, after the initial encounter with God's Holy Spirit, I began to wonder once more and feeling extremely frustrated this time, and knowing that clearly my prayers are being acknowledged. Um, I wouldn't say I was upset with God, but I was just more or less frustrated at the situation, and it was pretty emotional actually. I mean, I wasn't exactly yelling, but well, I take it back. There actually probably was a point where I do remember myself getting like pretty loud. But it wasn't anger towards God. It was just frustration at the situation and having been in a divine presence and just thinking to myself that I would have all the answers. Um, I felt empty, still. And I, had let my doubt grow to the point where I asked once again to have some sort of a revelation or some sort of a confirmation in my faith that I'm not a fool and that my eyes weren't deceiving me. And again, I called upon the name of God, and this time I had said some specific words that still ring in my memory, and you'll understand why in a moment. But essentially, there was a certain part in my prayer or my conversation with God where I was explaining to Him that acknowledging that I've been gifted, with with an intellect, that I could deceive myself to believe in something that was foolish just by the power of my own intelligence, and I don't want to trust myself. Like I said, I was questioning my senses and whatnot. And I specifically said the words, I don't want some sort of a sign in the skies or the clouds. Give me exactly the confirmation that I'm looking for. And that's basically the end of it. After that, I was just frustrated with the whole situation and went back to just basically doing pointless worldly things, going on walks. At the time, I had smoked cigars, so my thing was taking walks and smoking cigars, which brings me to the second encounter. Um, During an evening, I had went out for a walk to go pick up a cigar, and as I went to this Chevron gas station that I live near, I was actually friends with the gas station attendant. I knew her because I was friends with her husband at a former job, and she was basically just telling me what was going on with their life. She told me about how, her and her husband found out that they were having a son, um, and she explained to me that she'd picked out his name from the book of Ezekiel. Their son would be named Ezekiel, and a few other details, right? And I myself was telling her, was explained to her that I was kind of in a rough spot where I was changing jobs. I was very feeling uneasy about possibly moving halfway across town, and it just would have complicated my life in a number of ways. So in the middle of our dialogue, all of a sudden, once again, I feel a similar presence to the first presence, which now I know is recognizes, I guess if you want to put it this way, a divine energy, right? So I acknowledged that something had filled the room, but see, this wasn't like God. This didn't have like the all of those uh, perfect and balanced qualities that God has. Like just a perfect supreme authority. Um, and it it felt more of like a hot electric like warrior type quality, right? So it was a more of a warrior type quality. This powerful pressure, just a really strong force, right? Like a soldier. And the reason it was funny is because the guy that walked in was nothing like a soldier. Um, it was a black man that was about maybe 6'2", and maybe like late 40s. He had a slight bit of gray hair. He was wearing glasses, had one mole under his left cheek, and was dressed pretty conservatively. He basically had like he now that I think about it, he kind of dressed like the angels in the Hollywood movie City of Angels. He's basically having like a pea coat and the jeans and a like gray undersweater and not fit or anything, just like a regular average build, I guess. So a little on the slightly husky side. And the thing is I felt all this energy, right? It was like someone coming and slapping me in the back of the head. So immediately I like acknowledge that there was something going on in the room, and I look around and I see this guy, and he walks in, and he just looks like a real like joyous, happy person. And when he speaks, it sounds almost unbelievable because it borders on hokey because he's so happy and so joyous. It seems completely unnatural for any regular person in like today's world to be this way, right? Unless he's high or something. So I didn't know what to make of it. And still all this energy and this presence, right? So I know, like, obviously having the prior experience, I understood there was something going on here. Um, but still, you know, the situation being live and all, I didn't really have time to process everything completely. So, assuming he was a customer, I stepped to the side, and then let him interact with my friend Jordan, who was the attendant. And then immediately the guy begins to dialogue with her. Although the thing is I don't remember seeing him paying for anything, and she doesn't seem to either. But he made some sort of a transaction, but there was nothing that was ever done. Like not it was really weird when I think about it. It's almost as if the two of us were basically mesmerized and we're not actually paying attention to what was going on with the like the practicality of the situation. It was more or less sort of like we were in awe because or we were awestruck because of what was going on in their dialogue. And he was basically now keep in mind we were the only two people in this gas station. This guy didn't show up in a car or anything. He just appeared out of basically thin air and then came inside the gas station. No, there's no one in there before him, just us. Um, there's no open windows. It's a gas station, so it's enclosed. Um, this guy somehow knows everything that she just told me. He explains to her that she's gonna find his name, their son's name in the book of Ezekiel, and that um, he or that she was pregnant. She even went. He went on to explain how the birth was basically going to be an easy process, and that she had nothing to worry about, etc. And at still, right? I'm still thinking this could just be some kind of John Edwards cold reading nonsense where, if I'm intelligent enough to be skeptical of it, on the flip side, someone could be some kind of idiot savant or just some like sadistic genius and is coming in here just to mess with us because he's like some kind of mentalist or something. And he, in the middle of me doubting this, he turns to me and he says, "And you?" And I said, "What about me?" And he explains to me what I was beginning to explain to Jordan before he showed up, but he elaborated more into detail of things that I didn't explain to her. And he was explaining how, I is in the process of moving, and there's a lot of things that were up in the air in my life. And he was 100% right because I ended up moving one door over in the same community, ended up having a continuation on the same job, and everything ended up actually working out really well for me. Um, so he was right when he told me that I had nothing to worry about, same as he did her. And still, you know, still thinking that this is just a coincidence. Even though it's the probability of it, it's just astronomical. I'm still doubting it at the time. And same as before, the moment that I have that feeling, feeling this intense doubt, almost a sense of like, like I'm mocking the situation, right? Um, then uh, the man puts his hand on the door, and he's about to leave. When I have that feeling, he pulls his hand from the door, stops, and then turns around and then walks over to me and uh, extends his hand and smirks like he knows something that I don't know. And I shake his hand, and uh, you know, we grip flesh, and then he leans in and he says to me, "And in case you were wondering, yes, that's exactly the confirmation you were looking for." Um, and I, I don't feel comfortable saying the next part, um, so maybe for another time. Um, but essentially, there was something revealed to me in terms of a specific role um, that that God had been communicating to me through what I assume per that second experience was my encounter with an angel in human form. Right. This is often the case in per the biblical narrative that angels will take the form of mortal men in their appearance and might reveal themselves later on or something. But there is the ability to cloak um, their, I guess, nature, if you will. And the reason that this is interesting is because another aspect of that same prayer that he was quoting word for word, by the way, which is impossible because you know, not only does this confirm the first relationship with the first experience, and then the second, um, when I was actually making that prayer, but then months later that this man would cite it word for word in a specific manner of events that are direct. Um, it kind of makes your jaw drop. And I had specifically asked, begged, in fact, um, on hand and knees, asking God to make me an instrument. Like emphasizing that it's the least that I could do. In fact, the even funnier thing is that I said that I know deep down that there's no doubt that I was engaging your Holy Spirit. I have no idea why I'm doubting. I guess it's just the ignorance of the flesh. But in my heart of hearts, I know what happened. And during the time that I was in prayer, I had communicated that, and I felt almost, having been in the Spirit, in the presence of the Holy Spirit, I felt undeserving to ask such a thing twice, right? So I even said, you know, uh, like I would sooner ask you to send one of your holy angels than to make such a petty request. Especially since at the time I'm literally uh, admitting my cognitive dissonance, and um, that's exactly essentially what happened. I mean, people can doubt, they can be skeptical, that's fine. But um, what was confirmed to me afterwards, the things that I do not feel comfortable revealing at this time, um, was directly in relationship to the entirety of that prayer, involving my request being communicated by an angel out of respect, my you know yearning to be made as an instrument, knowing that the confirmation of my faith was real, and I wanted to be in this. Like, I wanted to do my part. Basically, I wanted to be a part of this. Um, and then, the truth starts to unravel even further, because I myself grew up without my father in my life. My stepfather was what I had as a father figure. I got to have an actual relationship with my father shortly after um, that encounter with God. And ironically, on the other side of the world, my father, who I didn't know, who had lived a rough life, had been in and out of jail, had become a missionary, um, had explained to me later on that he had a similar encounter where God basically explained to him that if he turned his life around, everything would be given to him that was like that he had lost through bad judgment on his part, on my father's part, and he had an encounter where he too was slain in the spirit when he was in Africa, and then things come full circle, and he and I have a great relationship to this day. Not having a relationship really with him ever my entire life until I was 36. I'm sorry, 35. And uh, it's crazy how things work out. That God was working with my father on the other side of the world and with me at the same time, and it wasn't until we were united into the body of Christ that we actually came together and were reunited as father and son. So it's interesting how these things work out. Um, I don't know how much more I should say on that, for the sake of time, and anything else you wanted to go into. But those are my two, I guess, divine experiences. I've had other experiences, but they certainly weren't divine. Um, they were more or less me coming into contact with what any Christian would refer to as uh, demonic activity.
Demonic activity, huh? Why don't you tell me a little?
All right. Well, after my first two divine experiences, um, later on, I had, when you are slain in the spirit, um, per the biblical narrative, you are granted what is known as spiritual discernment. So your relationship with God essentially allows you to, I guess, put your Roddy Piper they live glasses on. So you see things as they truly are. Like, you recognize components of the supernatural that you were completely blind to when you were just a worldly man. And um, I would begin to become, I guess, what some people in conspiracy terms refer to as targeted individuals, except that I wasn't being followed by government agents or anything like that. It was demonic activity. So, I would be riding a light rail or something, and then, a man who would be intoxicated or something would, um, began to approach me, and then I would see this man speak in like three different languages that I'm able to recognize, but not speak fluently whatsoever, but just to recognize the dialect because I study these things, and then having threats. And having the discernment, knowing that I'm not I'm not talking to a man. Most of these people that I come in contact with that are like this are troubled, and it's almost like just being a man of God and like having that sense of loyalty pisses them off, and you get confronted. So there's one instance where I had a friend that was did a few tours in the Mid East, and when he was back, we were all hanging out at a friend's house, and I was shocked to see what essentially was a demonic entity like right behind my friend, back to back. Um, and then, uh, same thing with the this guy that I had known, who's a coworker of mine, who was also there the same night, um, having, I guess, what you might refer to as like an oni, a Japanese oni or something. So this is
Were
a
you on
guy.
any drugs?
Was I? No. Um, seeing these things though. Um, now I will say this. There was a time where, in between my skepticism, right? Even after that, I had thought to myself, well, I'll go ahead and try to go, maybe go into the whole psychedelic thing, but I never got into it. It was more or less like it's not that I chickened out. Um,
Uh,
I, I guess I just felt like it was just stupid because I had after my initial two experiences, there was one time where I had actually tried um, a psychedelic, which is why I know that I was not under the influence for my original two when I had these encounters. So it wasn't some sort of like, you know, I've never done
I added.
LSD or anything, but yeah, but it wasn't some sort of reaction. Now here's the thing, right?
Unreaction?
Well, hey,
Re-
SoulDiver, real quick, was it? I meant like meth, weed, Adderall, alcohol, SSRIs. Were you on anything prescribed to you? Anything?
no, I've never taken any kind of psych meds or anything like that. Yeah, the only
Alcohol though?
drugs I've ever done are. What do you mean?
Were you drinking
What?
with your buddy that night? I mean, you said it was the same night.
No, no, I wasn't drinking.
Was he drinking?
Well, there's a reason why they call them spirits, right? These entities, whatever you want to call them, seem to come out and play when
Are
consciousness.
you guys still there?
Well, spirits are something you drink.
You
All right,
get my
sorry.
drift. It's connected.
He could have been. I mean,
Somebody's
I don't
causing some
know.
kind of echo, so everybody please try and use push to talk as much as possible.
Yeah,
So,
I'm not sure
SoulDiver,
if. Yeah.
I know you have opinions about like Freemasons and stuff like that. So, like, who do you think are the bad guys in all this? Like, tell us about the evil forces.
Uh, you particularly the Freemasons.
Well, or whoever you think are the evil forces. Like, who are the bad guys and who are the good guys?
Well, there are many satanic networks, right? What we might call in conspiracy terms roundtable groups or special interests. Um, so we have terms thrown around like Illuminati or things, but which I just basically use as an umbrella term. I don't specifically mean like that exact sect, but these are all essentially crypto satanic organizations. Like the Freemasons just happens to be the more prominent one because of of the goal of the of Freemasonry. So the crypto satanic theocracy that even most entry level conspiracy researchers will they'll return. I mean, they will turn a lot of evidence up that will make ties with satanic cabals. I mean, like that's just a thing. I mean, even the FBI has units that are that investigate this stuff as like a special case, the satanic ritual abuse victims. So, I mean, these are things that are known by local law enforcement or intelligence agencies. So it's not to say that, there isn't any kind of precedence, because clearly there is. But the thing is that because these are more of a shadow theocracy, an extra political macrocosm housing this political microcosm, a lot of things go unnoticed. So I prefer to use the term Freemason in the same way that I use Illuminati. I may say Freemasonic, or if I'm talking about a specific Freemason who is an actual Freemason, I actually might go into detail about, where they set and rank, or, their name and whatnot. But in a general sense, we can call them crypto Satanists because that's what they are. It just so happens, like I said, that Freemasons, their objective is specific to building a satanic church. Moreover, uh, Freemasonry was popularized in its demonstration through Babylon. Historically, that's how how it was first, or how it became so infamous, um, was through the Babylonian Empire. And so, when you study history in a large set, from ancient times to present, you actually see a parallel crash course between an ancient biblical thesis, the biblical narrative, and the antithesis, which is, what the Bible describes, the satanic opposition, idolatry, just everything that the Bible describes in terms of the agencies of Satan, right? The agencies of the accuser, the alliance of rebel angels, however you want to put it, the enemy, the villain, if you will. Um, and the Freemasons are essentially trying to I'll summarize and explain in detail how this is possible. But the Freemasons, essentially being Satanists, they embrace that role as representing the antithesis. So of course, what we refer to in the West as Lucifer. Lucifer's whole proclamation of essentially saying that he's going to um, counterfeit the whole reputation of God, right? Implies that he has to try to hijack the biblical narrative, which is the whole point of, what is mentioned in the later times as the Antichrist, right? So the counterfeit messianic. And the Freemasons are essentially trying to chase uh, the disciplinaries, cycles over time, the ways in which God decides to deal with man over specific ages. Freemasons, being stargazers and having learned this tradition from the rebel angels, who initially, you read this in the book of Enoch and other references where these rebel angels, sometimes referred to as the Watchers, um, basically gave mankind what we could refer to as a gun to a kid. So they hyper advanced their knowledge set, and they were like a kid with a gun. They didn't know what to really do with it, and so they got led off track away from God. But having this knowledge gave them this mechanical awareness of uh, of the cosmos, right? So they understood celestial constructs, planetary cycles and stars, as far back as you look in ancient history, during the Babylonian, Neo-Assyrian, it doesn't matter. They were all stargazers, and they had what they would refer to as astro tables, or you even had Phoenicians that would use what they would refer to in Europe as sextant rites. So it's like a triangulation device, a mariner's device, and these essentially all use stars or planets to chart, right? And inasmuch the Freemasons, and in ancient times the Babylonians, for which the Freemasons represent. They represent the Babylonian tradition of having this global one world empire. So in modern times, when we hear the New World Order, um, this is actually the Old World Order, and these are the Freemasons trying to realize the Antichrist kingdom, if you will. So in Revelations, when it discusses that the opposition will try to um, assert a kingdom, essentially, um, for the counterfeit archetype, um, the Antichrist. This is what the purpose is of all of their efforts. Now, the way that I've come to understand um, how this is so is during my research of ancient history and more or less studying the enemy, and looking at their tactics, and recognizing that the Freemason strategy is essentially this: they stargaze and create counter strategies to disciplinaries to try to turn the events in their favor. So if God tries to fulfill a prophecy or make something happen, they try to apply the antithesis, and assert the satanic agenda. This is also why to this very day the Freemasons even have gone as far as to hijack knowledge of the the purposing of God's creation, and like the true identity of the Messiah and whatnot, in the fact that they have like the zodiac and all of these occult sciences that are dedicated to this, and this is what the Freemasons use. So how are they able to sustain this plan? I know most people will be asking this question in their mind: how are Freemasons able to sustain this ancient conspiracy as far back as the Babylonian Empire, and before that, all the way to date, when the role, when the torch has switched so many hands over so many different eras? The reason is simple: they're stargazers, and they rely on the mathematical um, um, application of I should say they rely on the consistency of the celestial cycles. So planets often have what they refer to as conjunctions in certain sets, so you can predict and know, because this is mathematically reliable. You can understand, like, for example, there's a conjunction that is taking place. Um, there's a period where it peaks but goes into the initial sequence beginning in December 2020, and then peaking January 21st, 2021. So you have a conjunction, a triple set conjunction in right ascension between um, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto, and that marks a conjunction that is in the thousand a year mark. So it's basically like I believe it's the the mathematics. I'm still trying to work out the specifics of the calendar, but essentially, you could estimate between like 1600 to like 2300 or something like that. So close to 2,000 years, or a little over 2,000 years, which ironically, um,
Well, he just left. He just left. He was scared.
I was just going to say, isn't January?
yes, exactly. It's the official age of Aquarius. So on that date, when uh, the planets will pass uh, the the equator of the Milky Way galaxy and cross the Aquarian constellation, which, from the occult perspective, per the zodiacal references that we're discussing right now, they believe that that enters into the age of Aquarius. Um, sorry. Yeah, that also has a lot to do with why I think that um, things like Q and whatnot, or QAnon, are actually just distractions. Because it's quite a coincidence that it's never revealed who Q is. Q is essentially just supposed to be some hypothetical government rank or clearance, right? Whether it is or not, it's irrelevant because it's some deep throat that nobody can identify, and we're just supposed to take this person's word. And funny enough, the specific key words that this individual has popularized are, things like, winter's coming, or um, I forget what some of the other ones are, but the point is are you ready to see Wonderland or whatever? Like, these are all convenient references that serve as diversions because, interestingly enough,
It's
there's
called an
two
MK
things.
Ultra trigger, by the way.
What's
Sorry. It's called an MK Ultra trigger, by the way. Sorry to interrupt. They use Alice in Wonderland references a lot. They use a lot of. They used that. They actually used that one on me. The Winter is Coming. That's from Game of Thrones. Because when they hopped on me, this is when this was very popular. They reference pop culture things that are in the pop culture that are popular,
That's not
and
what
they
it is.
integrate
Yeah,
Wonderland. Yeah.
it's not mentioning it from Game of Thrones. What they're what see I can tell you exactly what's going on. Um, Remember, from my perspective, being anti-Freemasonic and understanding this, I recognize the Freemasonic element when I spot it, and in this case, the allusions to winter being vested in some supposed deep throat that's clearly working for a government that is heavily infiltrated by Freemasons. There's no doubt
Who started?
that the United States government is littered with Freemasons, right? I mean, even Trump's was it border security advisor is a Freemason who wears his pin proudly on air. So
George
it's
Washington
not
was
like,
too.
well, yeah, and then there's things I could say about George Washington too, but I don't want to stray off track. But the point being is that when they make these allusions, it's convenient that the same people that are saying these things happen to be related. I can tie to Freemasonic elements that, from their perspective, like I said, uh, apply the perversion of the celestial contract. So, for example, they won't respond to the Maseroth. So they won't basically look at more of a biblical interpretation of what could be, what some people say is like, a prophecy etched in stars, right? They instead refer to the zodiac. So it's convenient that it just so happens that the occult, being as that, like I said, the antithesis tries to mimic the biblical thesis. There's these series of pagan holidays that take place off and on throughout the year, like, like any theology would, right? Well, the holidays that take place with the pagans happen to be knockoffs of, I guess, what if you want to use like this word, like the Jewish calendar. So the feasts, like calendar, these things all correspond to what the pagans essentially ripped off from God's people as, they hijacked them as Azeroth, if, and called it the Zodiac, and so they represented and gave credit to satanic archetypes that had nothing to do with the actual implication of this, and they do it with the calendar. They mimic the calendar. So anytime there's some feast that takes place during one of the four main seasons out of the year, the pagans just so happen to mimic this. You see this later on, when Constantine was in power. That's why Christians now have Easter and Christmas, which have nothing to do with the old calendars, right? But there they are anyway. And um, when they say winter, from their pagan perspective, the Freemasons' perspective, they're actually referring to a winter solstice. And you can point out, I mean, these are calendarized, right? So it's not like it's my opinion that there happens to be certain holidays that take place on these certain days, or even per their zodiac, that the emphasis of certain constellations that mythologically in ancient times were associated with these same holidays happen to line up and so on and so forth. And so the point is, is that they sorry, I think I cut out a little bit there for a second. Um, Point being, though, this is just mimicry. So whenever there happens to be some sort of an actual holiday, which, by the way, is a word meaning holy day. So if it's not part of God's calendar, it's not a holy day, which is convenient that per the pagan perspective, every single time there is some sort of a holy day, there just happens to be a counterfeit on the flip side, just as you would expect from a counterfeit, per the antithesis. So that when they say winter, that's what they're referring to. And also, like I said, this span of holidays just so happens to take place during the exact time of this conjunction, and also it just so happens to be that a particular zodiacal archetype that the occultists would refer to as Ophiuchus just so happens to be emphasized also during that time around the winter solstice. So these are things that are very convenient, in regards to Q just happening to uh, sort of trigger people by fixing and diverting their view in regards to the true reasons for wanting to warn people about winter.
Well, this has been really interesting. I don't know how long we've been going now. How are you feeling, SoulDiver? Oh, he's gone. Does anyone else have anything to say? What's up, Moby?
Hey, what's up? I just kind of joined in, and um, I guess I'm coming in towards the tail end of this, but I heard maybe what would be considered a mischaracterization of Hegelian dialectics, because, but I think that that's kind of an offset from what you guys were talking about. So,
Well, there's a dialectic involved, but we were talking about a true dichotomy.
yeah, okay.
So, SoulDiver, we've been going for probably 2 hours. I'm not sure. It's been a really good podcast. Ian Software, I assume our recording's still going. So, SoulDiver, do you want to put a message out to whatever audience this podcast may eventually have? Is there something you want them to know? A specific mission or vision?
I'm sorry, I have a lot going on in the background all of a sudden. Sorry, my kids just woke up, so I'm getting a little distracted.
Well, and we appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to talk to us. And we, like I'm saying, we've been going about 2 hours. So I'm just wondering, before we close up for tonight, is there a kind of a message you might want to get out? So say this podcast ends up being heard by 100 people or 500 people. What would you want them to hear?
Well, definitely to get right with God, before the events of 2020, because from there, based on what I know about the Freemasonic agenda, they definitely want to step up, the Agenda 21, which ironically, once again, like I said, 2021 coincides with the time of this conjunction, in which the Freemasons believe is supposed to be the era, the age of Aquarius, that ushers in the dawning of their Antichrist archetype, which they associate per the constellation of Ophiuchus. You can go look at the mythology of Ophiuchus to understand more about that. So I would say, considering I would say that considering knowing what the Freemasons' agenda actually is, having said that, that you can assume, based on the fact that they, like I said, try to create um, disciplinary counter strategies opposed to God's will, um, and because we know that the Freemasons are essentially kingdom builders trying to gather a satanic body, a satanic church, um, the New World Order or the Old World Order, so Neo-Babylon, if you will, to align the powers through rigged warfare between World Wars One, Two, and the current, um, and until the state of affairs worldwide, um, climaxes, and then there was an establishment of, what in the conspiracy world is referred to as a new world order. And that being said, and having the knowledge that per the occult theology, that this day has a specific significance as it, relates potentially to an Antichrist archetype, I would definitely urge people to look into this and really consider repenting to Christ and actually developing a relationship with God, understanding that Jesus is God, and really giving the Bible a fair shake. I mean, maybe some other time, when I'm not as occupied, we can go into more about this, because there's like so much to cover. I honestly don't even know where to begin, so I'm just trying to scattershot to just put a few concepts out there in the know, and then, if you want, we can always go into deeper detail at another time.
Well, and that's exactly it, SoulDiver. So I'm glad. I think this is our second or third event we've done, at least second recorded. We did the NSA versus SoulDiver debate, and now we've done this event, and I think there was another one. But regardless, this can absolutely be a recurring series, and I would like it to be. But I think we've gone to a great length tonight. It's been great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, SoulDiver. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Ainsoft, for the recording. So I'm just going to close this event now by saying, as I forgot to say at the beginning, please find us on Roundtable Discord server. You can just Google Roundtable Discord server. You can find us through the conspiracy or politics tag of Discord. You can also, sorry about my cat, that is Guffy. You can also find us on all social media, Patreon, GoFundMe, Twitter, Twitch, Instagram, Reddit, Facebook, YouTube, Google, Periscope, Tumblr, etc. So you can find us there. We have a website, we have a forum community. NSA does indeed masturbate for the NSA to
Yeah, dude.
watch.
Well, so I was gonna say, yeah, if you want to come out to Austin, Texas, and get drunk with an alien guy, come on out and buy me drinks.
Exactly. Join us on the Roundtable Discord server. Participate in the madness. Otherwise,
We'll
fuck
take some
you.
extra.
That's it. Thanks, everybody.
For sure.